Hello, everyone. I'm Alla Marchenko, president of the Aurora Philosophy Institute. Our speaker this evening is Howard Leznoff, who will be presenting the topic, Aesthetics and the Other Branches of Philosophy. Howard will give us an overview of the theory of aesthetics, the philosophy of art, and some talking points for further discussion. Howard, by the way, is an artist himself, a published poet. He knows whereof he speaks, as the saying goes. Over to you, Howard.
Thanks very much, Alan, and thanks, John, for the opportunity. I'm looking forward to this, a little nervous, but also looking forward to the opportunity to share some ideas with you and let you know what I found out from looking around at stuff. So I'm now going to go to screen share. Thanks very much. So aesthetics, the philosophy and beauty of art. This is really a partial overview. I mean, any one of these topics could be elaborated on for, hours, if not more. So even Platonic or Aristotelian philosophy of art or aesthetics. So I'm providing a very sort of broad overview and selective and partial. Generally, I'm going to talk about beauty, art, and the sublime, relationship, the questions of consciousness, mimesis and metaphysics, formalism, and aesthetic judgment. And I'm going to talk a little bit about aesthetic culture and institutions and sociopolitics and how aesthetics are situated, and that comes under the branch of social political theory. But I'll do that incidentally, in passing, and the same thing with aesthetics. And the same thing with aesthetics and ethics, art, value, and morality. A lot of the literature in terms of the ethical piece focuses on the value of aesthetics and art for creating empathy and recognizing the other in a way as we recognize ourselves. A final footnote here, I guess, at the very end of the process, I came across a number of readings on the aesthetics of everyday life or living aesthetically or attentiveness to beauty in daily life. And some of that is tied into Eastern philosophies. And I found that pretty intriguing, and I'll probably get back to that as I, when I get back into the subject matter. In terms of illustrating the points, I'm using a lot of visual art here just because it's spatial and it's expedient. Music moves through time, as does narrative. So those are more time consuming. So I'm using visual art. I've tried to, in terms of selection, I tried to, choose pieces that made the point most aptly. And I also tried to go for some variety, but invariably, you overlook stuff, and there's a selectivity process in there. And keeping in mind too, that the medium that we're working with in these screens, so some of the pieces of artwork are quite large and overwhelming, and we're going to see them on a small screen. Kind of reminds me of a joke from a stand-up comic. He said, I'm so glad I got my Apple Watch. Now I can watch Gone with the Wind on a screen the size of a postage stamp. So we're recognizing sort of the limitations of the media that we're working with when talking about aesthetics and beauty. Even a picture of a sunset is still a picture. I'm going to try and... So philosophy, aesthetics is essentially the philosophy of the beautiful and art. Those are the two main branches of it. It also looks at a series of principles for the appreciation and making of art and the beautiful. A lot of the aesthetic theory that I came across seemed to be written for practitioners, so that's why I've included making in there. A lot of the system of principles for appreciation. So a lot of that comes under formalism, which we'll get to later. Okay. Here's C. Sartwell. He's kind of cheerleading and a little boosterism for aesthetics. He says beauty and art and philosophical aesthetics cover the most enduring and controversial themes in philosophy. And he notes as well that beauty has traditionally been counted among the ultimate values, with goodness, truth, and justice. Those are, I guess, three main Platonic values, and beauty is up there with the higher forms for Plato. I think it informs, or is the basis of the philo, the love in philosophy of art. So while Plato doesn't have much affection for artists or things made, beauty does figure prominently in his philosophy as a kind of as part of an urgent quest or a longing for the beautiful, and that turns into a longing for knowledge and truth. This screen's a bit heavy, so, and I apologize for the density of it, but it might not be a bad way to start off making some connections between philosophical aesthetics and the other branches of philosophy. So in terms of metaphysics and ontology, some of the main questions come across in the literature are what is beauty, essentially? What's the essence of beauty? What's the essence of art? How do those connect to human nature, what we are, human ontology? Some of the enduring themes of philosophy more broadly obviously inform philosophical aesthetics. We have object, subject, internal, external, absolute, relative, universal, et cetera, and the relationships and dynamics between those binaries and dichotomies. And also the relationship of art and reality to truth. There's an old adage, poets lie to tell the truth. And I guess part of what that implies is that they use artifice and they manipulate elements in order to get maybe at a more fundamental or psychological truth about what we really are. And so the idea is that by manipulating materials, they can reveal a fundamental reality. In terms of epistemology, we get a lot of the literature deals with a sort of rationalism, empiricism binary, and everything in between. Kant and others look at the faculties that are at work and the mental processes that are at work when we experience beauty and experience art. Sensory perception, reason, to imagination and intuition, all that stuff. And I think we also recognize there's sort of a dialectic at work. Our faculties are conduits for experiencing art and beauty, but art and beauty as well, I think, reconfigures and rewires and gets us to recognize those faculties. So I guess the second part of that dialectic implies that art changes us, how we see the world, how we think, and how we feel. Maybe that's a kind of ambitious claim for art. Lots of intersections, theoretical intersections between ethics and aesthetics. Horace in 19 BC says the purpose of art, and he's talking about dramatic art or narrative art, is to delight and instruct. So it's not just about feeling pleasure or getting a good feeling from it, according to Horace. It's also about engendering wisdom, knowledge, and ethics, and maybe fulfilling our species potential. And I think Aristotle makes a similar point in his Poetics about the sort of the ethical value of art. I'm thinking of my own experience of a tension between sort of didacticism and pleasure. I can watch a movie like Austin Powers and take a lot of pleasure from it and enjoy it and laugh and like it, but it's not going to challenge me all that much in terms of how I see myself in the world, or it's not going to offer that much in terms of thematic content about human nature. So Austin Powers would be heavy on the pleasure and heavy on the delight and light on the instruct. I can imagine something on the other end that I don't like because I find it too teachy or too preachy, or the didacticism overwhelms the beauty and the delight. So there's that tension there. Art for art's sake, a movement suggests really that any goal beyond experiencing beauty itself is a corruption of art. So that would be any ethical purpose or political purpose, or it's a second nature, a second tier art, if it does anything than explore beauty itself. Again, for Plato, art is dangerous, and for Aristotle, it's important to ethics. Finally, in social political theory, we recognize that theories and assessments and experiences of art, they're situated historically, culturally, philosophically, institutionally, ideologically. So this philosophical aesthetics emerged in early 18th century, and so it's not surprising that the dominant themes and tensions of philosophy overall make their way into those projects and those explorations. Ontology and human development, I guess a general question, what role do aesthetic sensibilities and experiences play in who we are, becoming fully human and being fully human? How are human beings' relationships with beauty and art and making fundamental to who we are? and how we understand and know ourselves. And the stuff's obviously very old. There's a 42,000-year-old flute, and the figure on the right is said to be the oldest sculpture depicting a human form. And I'm thinking about the emergence of human consciousness and what it would have been like as human consciousness gets more refined to try and deal with things like procreation, sexual desire, fertility, as that statue depicts, death, to say nothing of dreams, what might have been like to be an early hominid and to have woken up from a dream without having an understanding of that. So I think the anthropology, the history of art can reveal a lot about who we've been and our struggles and our journey to understand ourselves. So I put it this way, I guess: since our earliest days, what we are and how we understand ourselves and our places in the natural, social, and cosmic orders has been realized through symbolic representation. And Werner Hoffman makes a similar point. He says, the emergence of symbolic material culture represents a fundamental threshold, and that should be the evolution of humankind. So man as maker, we don't just make, we didn't evolve and come to be who we are today just by making tools, but we make symbolic representations. We create symbolic universes. Various language facilities emerge. Some have posited through music that, music probably preceded language and makes language possible. In Lascaux caves, in the recesses, this is the earliest depiction of a human being in those caves, and it looks to be sort of working with life and death consciousness. There's a bison on the right whose viscera is spilling out, and it looks like there's some sort of boar animal on the left with drops coming out of its tail. I'm not sure what that's about, but the only figure in that cave, far away from the Hall of the Bulls, is this humanoid bird figure, and there's a ton have been written about this scene from the shaft in the Lascaux caves, and most of it posits that figure as some sort of shamanistic figure, and whether the bison killed the hunter or not, or whether the shamanistic figure is just confronting the death of the bison, is sort of up for grabs. But a ton's been written. Some have noted that bird might be an early symbol of flight, spiritual transformation, and so on. I guess that, the main point is this stuff is old, and through symbolic culture, we've come to recognize who we are, and aesthetics is tied into evolutionary psychology, evolutionary biology, sociology, all those things. Therianthropic figures combining the human and the animal are also a feature. I wouldn't say universal, but they're certainly ubiquitous. And those also would posit human beings simultaneously in the natural, human, and cosmic worlds. A lot of those features were demigods. And so they simultaneously define humanness with those other qualities that are non-human. I'm tempted to read that central image, the Battle of the Centaurs, as, I don't know what, it might lend itself to a Freudian reading, half man, half beast, using technology and tools to kill another beast, or maybe it's id ego and super ego, maybe that's a stretch. Okay, so aesthetics in the literature, it breaks down often into two branches: beauty and nature, and art, human-made beauty. On the beauty and nature part, we can divide it into physical material, appreciation of physical material beauty. And I want to include also maybe human relational, conceptual, and psychological beauty as natural. So obviously, if I come across a sunset or a starlit sky, I can be overwhelmed on the sensory level, and appreciate the beauty of that and be awed by it, or the delicate intricacy of a flower. But I can also recognize beauty on a human relational level that doesn't have anything to do with really sensory appeal. If I'm walking in the park and turn a corner and see an old couple dancing in the forest, I might be warmed by that and think it's beautiful, or I can recognize the beauty of a friendship or the beauty of a gesture. So, and I'll include all those as quote unquote natural. On the other side, we have human-made beauty, art, and artifacts, which include the pure arts, visual art, literature, theater, dance, film, and I mean those pure arts also taking place within institutional contexts and social contexts, and also functional aesthetics, where maybe the beauty is secondary to a pragmatic or practical purpose. Architecture, crafts, industrial design, fashion, culinary art, those all involve an element of intentionally bringing beauty into the everyday and the practical. So on the chair on the right, I guess if it's too feeble to be sat upon, then it becomes a more purely aesthetic object rather than a functional one. I've included my favorite can opener because every time I pick it up, I get intense pleasure from using it. It functions beautifully. It fits nicely in the hand compared to other can openers that I've used. It's an absolute pleasure to use. It looks good. It's ergonomic, et cetera, et cetera. So yeah, beauty covers a sort of a broad, aesthetics covers a broad field. Well, throughout the presentation, I might just have a little aesthetic interludes that will speak for themselves. Now, I have to confess, oops, I'm having a hard time seeing my screen because there's all sorts of stuff on it that I can't shrink, but I think I'll work through it. So what essentially is beauty? I guess the one premise of analytic philosophy is to define your terms and be clear about the concepts that you're working with. And we can see that even a dictionary definition for Merriam-Webster's gets us quite far. And I don't want to sort of dive in too deeply and pick this apart word by word, though I'm tempted to do it. Webster describes beauty as a quality, group of qualities in a person or thing that gives pleasure to senses or the mind. So I guess from a philosophical perspective, the first thing that we can note is that for Webster's, beauty is a quality, not a thing in itself. And for Plato, it was a thing in itself. And for Aristotle, it was a contingent quality that had to be attached to something else. So for Plato, whiteness could exist without white things. For Aristotle, not so. Whiteness could not exist without white things. So Merriam-Webster defines beauty as a quality that's attached to something else. We can see that lots of different things can qualify as beautiful and give us pleasure, whether it's the elegance of a mathematical formula or the beauty of a human face, or a sunset, or other elements of beauty in nature, or even the kind of puzzle and mind game presented by Escher's drawing hands. As we'll see shortly, pleasure means a number of different things, and not merely the pleasant or the appealing. And we'll talk about that when we get to the sublime. And finally, the Merriam-Webster's definition does note the standard dichotomy, epistemological tension between objects of perception and objects of the intellect, or the sensory apparatus and the mind, the cognitive. So this dictionary definition takes us quite far into some of the standard debates about philosophical aesthetics. Okay, oops, sorry. Kant. It's Kant's, I guess, named as the first modern philosopher, and presents us with the first modern philosophy of aesthetics. And so I'm going to mention him here just in an introductory way, and I'll come back to him at the end. I didn't know much about Kant's aesthetics, so I spent 3 or 4 days reading around it. I didn't read the primary text, but I read a bunch of essays, and I think I was able to cobble together, maybe at best, because he's notoriously abstruse, a rudimentary understanding of Kant's ethical system. So for Kant, he's not asking whether beauty is an independent entity or it's contingent upon something else. Kant, in his critique in The Power of Judgment, is asking what's happening in the mind when we experience something, an object, as beautiful. His answer is sort of complicated, but I think I kind of get it. He says, the pleasure we get from experiencing beauty comes from a complex but free and harmonious interplay of a priori faculties, specifically sensibility, sense perception, that is, imagination and understanding. So he says we see something, and cognitively we're not quite sure what to make of it. Our sense perception, our imagination, and our understanding are kind of vibrating or interacting in what he calls free but harmonious ways, and the result is a pleasure at experiencing beauty. He says part of the freedom comes from the fact that aesthetic experience is disinterested. That means it's, for him, decoupled from desire or self-interest, and also it's decoupled from firmly determined concepts. The experiences are indeterminate, open-ended, and maybe preconceptual. So I guess in terms of disinterest, if I smell an apple pie, I'm interested in acquiring that apple pie, or the smell leads me to an interest in the apple pie. If I smell a flower, I'm happy to experience the smell of the flower on its own without any other desire or self-interest. That's pretty much as far as I got with this piece of it. And if other people have things to supplement, that would be great, or ways to flesh this out a little more clearly. So experiencing beauty and aesthetic judgment. I'm reminded again of Kant's central division between noumenon, the thing in itself, independent of human consciousness, the thing out there, presumably, and phenomenon, the thing as experienced, filtered through sensory apparatus and consciousness. So here's I guess, a little diagram of a woman seeing something and then making and she might experience it as beautiful. I guess we often, or one of the adages about aesthetic experiences, I don't know much about art, but I know what I like. And so, what does that mean to say I know what I like, or I know what appeals to me? So I tried to break down some of the constituents of consciousness, and some of them, they all interlap and interpenetrate, or overlap and interpenetrate. But maybe for the sake of sort of conceptual modeling, we can break down the elements of consciousness into the evolutionary and biological, and evolutionary biology and psychology, whether that's a sex drive or social instinct or hunger. There's the neurology of consciousness, all the brain stuff and sensory apparatus stuff that we saw during the philosophy of mind presentation. There's biographical. We have unique experiences that imprint themselves neurologically in different ways. If that young woman had been unfortunately abused by her grandparents, she might not see that as beautiful as all, or she might be conversely filtering that experience through her own unique biographical experience of the elderly or her grandparents. There's obviously the epistemics, knowledge systems, everything from sensory perception to imagination to ethics. Everything gets filtered in the brain through linguistic circuits, and we can think of some. I guess we can be conscious without language. I don't know whether we can have concepts per se without language, or the precision of our concepts might be only as precise as the precision of our language. And that plays a role in aesthetics too. We often hear that sort of beauty is ineffable. It's beyond words. It can't be described. Those experiences sort of transcend symbolic or linguistic representation. And there's obviously the sociocultural experiences of beauty take place in social context, institutional contexts. We also might have a background in art, or in wine drinking, so in wine tasting. So some of our aesthetic experiences have to do with maybe a specific exposures to different types of sensory experience. And also, I know if you studied art history or studied music, you might have a different understanding of a piece of art or a piece of music. Some jazz might be an acquired taste. I don't know. It might take a while before those things become pleasurable, but there are contexts for all of those. Okay, so here's a little. I put together a little slideshow, a series of paintings for the most part, and I'm going to play them through 4 seconds of each. You're welcome to maybe filter them through a question of whether they appeal primarily to sensory experience or conceptual or ideas or concepts. or you can just enjoy them and ask, or you can ask yourself, does this appeal to me or not? Why or why not? And or you can just enjoy them and take a break from me talking, or have a break from me talking. That last one this one's a sculpture, by the way. It's not a photograph. Okay. To unpack pleasure a little bit, because one component of pleasure that was noted during the 17th or 18th century is the sublime. So in terms of aesthetic theory, pleasure and delight don't just come from what's appealing, but they also come from, that which might be irresistibly awesome, or it might overwhelm or terrify or disrupt or decenter. So I guess one principle of the sublime is that it can be, that the ugly and dreadful can be beautiful. And that might come back to, again, the sort of essentialist, maybe primal instincts, fear and death. But the sublime movement emerges as a series of aesthetic principles. So there it is. It reemerges in the 18th century as part of a movement from neoclassical, which focused on harmonious relationships, formalism, rational order, mathematics, and restraint, to romantic, which celebrated intense emotion, awe, boundlessness, turbulence, existential reckoning, maybe, and terror. So sublime became of aesthetic interest, and there was a fair bit written about it. As John Addison says in 1699, a group of artists went to Italy and they saw the Alps, and Addison says, the Alps fill the mind with an agreeable kind of horrors. There's a paradox there. William Butler Yeats, witnessing political violence in Ireland, writes in Easter 1916, all is changed, utterly changed. A terrible beauty is born. Again, so there's that, there's an oxymoron there. And Edmund Burke says, whatever is filled to excite ideas of pain and danger, whatever is terrible, is the source of the sublime. That is productive of the strongest emotion which the mind is capable of feeling. So again, there's that kind of elementalism, that sort of raw, maybe it goes back to evolutionary psychology, and the sense of danger. And I think of my own experiences, and maybe, if we see people slowing down at an accident site and rubbernecking it, there's a certain appeal. There's an attraction of the repellent. It's repellent and attractive at the same time. Or if I watch those nature documentaries, often the climax is, that the moment when the predator captures the prey. So there's something kind of horrible about it, but maybe beautiful as well. Or in the slow motion demolition of a building or something. Edward Burke, when he's explicating on the sublime, he spends some time talking about this picture by George Stubbs, a lion attacking a horse. And we can see again that sort of elemental terror in the face of the horse, and a sort of life and death fundamental urgency in this picture. It also combines, I think, classical elements with romantic elements. I'm going to put on the screen the laser pointer, I think. So we obviously at the center of, I guess the center piece of this work of art is the terror, abject terror, and maybe death realization of the horse. Behind that, dark and mysterious and unknown, is the lion, and the lion's teeth digging into the flesh of the horse. In terms of in terms of classical, in terms of formal elements, you have pretty much a perfect circle in which at the center of the piece, and the painting is composed such that the circle is absolutely dead center of the canvas. So there's a formal circularity there. There's the musculature of the horse, which kind of calls together neoclassical elements. We can think of a Greco-Roman statue. There's a diagonal line which directs the eye directly to that dark, mysterious center. There's a diagonal line here, and diagonal lines typically connote action or dynamism. There's another diagonal line with this tree. There's a contrast between the tree here and the tree here, so there's a sense of formal balance in the two trees. This area of the picture is darker. The horse is facing this side, and we get a sense of nature in turbulence. The storm is brewing. This isn't a still life. This is still, active life and death. Again, incorporating both neoclassical elements, formal elements, and romantic elements. There's just a close-up of the face of the horse and the lion barely visible. And again, we can see, there's the real formal aesthetic working through there in that circle. It's not just the sublime that challenges the idea that pleasure has to be appealing or pleasing as opposed to repellent or decentering or challenging or disruptive. So here's Max Ernst. He puts together a collage in 1920, post-World War I, and he helps usher in the Dada movement, an aesthetic movement, but it's not really centered on pleasure per se. It's quite explicitly a moral and intellectual reaction. So he says, to us, Dada was above all a moral reaction. He talks about rage and subversion. He talks about the futility of World War I. And then he says, we had experienced the collapse into ridicule and shame of everything represented to us as just, true, and beautiful. The world order as it's understood collapses for them after World War I. It's interesting too, just, true, and beautiful happen to be Platonic, those Platonic terms. So he says, my works of that period were not meant to attract, they were meant to make people scream. So that's an element of aesthetics as well, even though aesthetics is initially posited as a philosophy of the beautiful, we might recognize that some truths are hard to confront, but maybe confronting the truth is a sort of beauty there. Again, we can see that art and art movements are historically and politically and culturally situated. And here's the example of Dada, but you could go through a neoclassicism, you can go through the Renaissance, you can go through social realism, impressionism, and find those sorts of cultural, intellectual, philosophical markers either informing those movements either directly or indirectly. I think Dada was a fairly influential movement culturally in terms of helping people make sense of post-war and getting people, maybe it was a vanguard movement in terms of culture, philosophy, and intellectual understanding of the post-war era, maybe. Mimesis and metaphysics. So, according to Halliwell, mimesis is one of the oldest and most fundamental concepts in Western aesthetics. Seneca says all art is an imitation of nature. Mimesis is typically defined as imitation, copy, representation, likeness, and then it gets into something more bidirectional. Mimesis isn't just an external copy of something else, but it explores similarity, and it involves assimilation and a breakdown of the self, the internal and the external, to sort of come back to that crude binary. On the right, we see, I guess this is called a photorealism. It's a pretty, I think, skilled representation of an orange. So for Aristotle, mimesis is a central concept in his Poetics. He says mimesis, both in the doing and the observing or taking in, is natural, necessary, and pleasurable. He says the instinct of imitation is implanted in man from childhood. He is the most imitative of all living creatures, and it's through imitation that he learns his earliest lesson. So I guess it's a fairly it's noteworthy empirical observation that we become who we are, and we become human through imitation. As infants, we acquire language through imitation. Lots of parent-child games involve sort of the aesthetics of rhythm, Twinkle, Twinkle, Little Star, and Patty Cake, Baker's Man. So or even on a pure neurological basis, our neurology is reconfigured because of mimetic activity. We understand who we are. We develop a sense of language and consciousness of ourselves and others through the imitative act. So it's not just in terms of evolutionary psychology or evolutionary biology, but also in terms of human development within any given human. So for Aristotle, there's two aspects of mimesis. One is we take pleasure from imitating, but we also, he says, take pleasure from witnessing or experiencing things imitated. And so I included two photographs on the bottom that show people deeply involved in dramatic representations, I assume in this case film. But we think about how we can be frightened or moved to tears by an imitative mimetic representation. And again, something's going on in the neurological level. I think I've forgotten a point about this, but I can't recall. The quote says, through mimesis, the distinction between the self and the other becomes porous and flexible. He says the Cartesian categories of subject and object are not firm, but rather malleable. Observing subjects, it's not just a question of copying, they assimilate themselves into the objective world. So again, I think I'm making an ontological point here about how central mimesis is to who we are and what we are as a species. And some of that's been validated by neuroscience, discovery of mirror neurons and the role they play in those mimetic functions. And the neuroscience suggests that these mirror neurons are fundamental in breaking down the self and other, and fundamental to empathy and ethics. And actually, Aristotle makes the same point. He says that poetry is more philosophical than history. And he says because poetry gets at universals. And I think he's making a point about human psychology. Poetic drama reveals who we are. He also says later that we take pleasure from watching the virtuous, and we also take displeasure from watching people who are not virtuous. And so that might apply to his dramatic theory as well. So mimesis is fundamental to development of consciousness, self-consciousness, consciousness of the world, and also presumably or arguably ethics. Okay, here's another aesthetic interlude. Again, you feel free to just enjoy it as it is. I did have some guiding questions. Let me just see. Oh, you can ask yourself what's represented and how, or again, ask yourself whether the appeal is, primarily sensory or primarily cognitive, or you can just whether you like them or don't and why, or you can just let the images wash over you. Northrop Frye in The Educated Imagination, and I'm paraphrasing here, basically he says, all literature has one theme, identity. Who am I, and who or what are we as a species? And so that's a question that I think I either directly or indirectly bring to aesthetics and my exposures to art, film, maybe less so music. Mimesis, representation, and inner and outer reality. I put together this little spectrum of the concrete and the more deliberately, explicitly representational, the peach on the left, to the more abstract. Ideally, I would have found still life of fruits all the way through. But we can see sort of a spectrum whereby the external world is given increasingly less credence as we move from left to right. And I guess it's the internal interpretive emotional world that that gets more expression as we move along the spectrum. Jackson Pollock says the modern artist is working and expressing an inner world, in other words, expressing the energy, motion, and other inner forces. So, I mean, does the piece on the far left is actually a painting. I don't know what the medium is, but it's not a photograph, but it looks very darn realistic. I guess it's hyperrealism or photorealism, they call it. And so I'm very, very impressed by the technical skill. And it does it represent a deference to external material reality? That's why I asked, can art be philosophically neutral? Is any piece of art embedded with, at the very least, a metaphysical position about, maybe the role of internal and external lives, or the interplay of internal and external lives? And again, I recognize this is a kind of dichotomy that's perhaps overused, but I think conceptually it still gets us somewhere. Is the peach on the right more, I don't know, conservative or something? I'm not sure what the terminology is, but we can see different things get represented. Even in that Chagall piece, we saw some aspects were recognizable, some aspects weren't. Jackson Pollock says at one point, when he does those splatter paintings, what he wants to do is generate a kind of freedom. So there's no center to the picture and there's nothing represented. It's just, sensory experience. And he makes an argument for freedom out of that. There's no central focus point. The artist isn't presumably bullying you into anything. Maybe just a simple question in terms of, fidelity to the external, if that's the term, and something more expressive. Of these two, which would you rather hang in your home if you could have either of them, and why, and what does that say about the value of strict fidelity to the external world or something? I don't know, maybe photography makes the painting on the right less relevant, because there are other ways to get pictures of three peaches, but the skill is still pretty damn impressive. In some ways, is it analogous to the skill of a gymnast doing a gymnastic routine on the parallel bars or something, or a soccer player? Soccer, the beautiful game, that's what it is. Mimesis and art, what sorts of subjects are suitable for imitation, representation, assimilation as art? Well, virtually anything, the natural world, human buildings, the phantoms of the imagination, political figures, houses. I wanted to call attention to the Gleaners, the picture on the top right, very, very controversial when it came out. The idea was that why would we want to see peasants working in a field? It didn't get a very good reception at all from the salons in Paris. A lot of commenters thought it was too close. The French Revolution had only been, I think, 57 years before, and so they found this painting dangerously provocative, which seems odd to us now, and they thought it was ugly as well. And so again, we can see what qualifies as art or subjects are suitable for representation is dependent on historical context. And I guess if an artist chooses to render something, he or she is saying, this needs to be separated from everyday experience. This deserves attention beyond the quotidian. And so it's centering them out. The top piece of the urinal, there's some interesting history to that. Duchamp, and he could really paint representationally. when he wanted to. But at some point, he decided to submit that to a gallery in Paris. A couple of points about formalism. I mentioned formalism early with the line attacking the horse. Formalism posits that there are principles and rules of formal aesthetic properties that yield aesthetic pleasure and inform aesthetic judgments, as opposed to mere subjective taste or cultural or institutional consensus. And I'll get to some of those principles shortly. For formalists, and there's a range of people from the formalist school, some more moderate, some more radical, but generally formalists thought that sensory perception was primary in aesthetic experience, that ideation, conceptualization were best secondary. Walter Pater says, all art constantly aspires to the condition of music. And I think what he meant is that music is more free from conceptualization and pure in that way. Instrumental music, when we have lyrical music and lyrics, then we're kind of nudged towards meaning. But for Walter Pater, a formalist, all art constantly aspires to instrumental music, just that freedom from conceptualization. And maybe that's what makes it relax. Maybe that's what makes music relaxing and instrumental music relaxing, is it takes us out of conscious experience. So for the formalists and the art for art's sake folk, background knowledge, historical context, biography are irrelevant, and they interfere with pure aesthetic experience and appreciation. Again, beauty in itself has a sole aesthetic value. There shouldn't be any utility, whether it's ethical or in terms of enlightenment or knowledge. It should just be pure. It's mostly a critical approach, though at times it does emerge as an artistic movement in reaction to intellectual movements or cultural movements. So formalism and aesthetic judgment, it posits again that there are clearly delineated aesthetic principles that can form aesthetic judgment. And some of those notable ones have been line, shape, symmetry, balance, harmony, composition, relation of whole parts, etc., etc. And some formalists claim that these principles can or should deliver universality and objectivism. That is, these are objectively real, universal, and immutable principles of beauty. And so we see some of that, and some of that mathematical precision coming out in during the Renaissance with studies of perspective that very specifically use sort of mathematics and mathematical measurement to try and recreate external reality as accurately as possible. There's the Vitruvian Man that we're all familiar with. I'd never done the exercise, but I decided to do it, and I spread my arms out on the wall and measured it, and it was pretty much my height, or very close to my height. Vitruvius, by the way, was an architect, and he's had one little paragraph about the body that Leonardo da Vinci picked up on, but virtually all the body of his work is dedicated to architecture. So we come again, I'm going to finish off with Kant and his answer to the problem. I mean, in his first and second critiques of pure reason and practical reason, he wanted to come up with proofs and absolute standards, but he recognized that matters of taste are different. So he comes up with, again, this paradox of a subjective universality. And he says, while judgments of taste are subjective, we expect, and some readings of Kant say demand, that they be universal and communicable. That is, a series of principles are realized through dialogue and aesthetic common sense within a community, a sensus communis aesthetics. And I was thinking about this empirically and in sort of my day-to-day interactions with people, and how their tastes are subjective, but they get really excited about something that they find aesthetically appealing, and kind of want to insist that you find the same thing beautiful. So even if somebody watches a series of, I don't know, Succession or something else, and oh, you got to watch this series, it's great, have you watched that series yet? They're really sort of emotionally committed to what they find beautiful, and they want to universalize it. There's the same thing with tasting food. Oh, this is great. You got to taste this. No, I don't feel like it. Come on, just taste it. Taste it. What's the matter with you? How could you not like avocado or something? So I think empirically, just looking around, I recognize that there is this desire to universalize our subjective tastes. And Kant says that we can get somewhere through looking at formalist principles. So Christian Wenzel says at the end, aesthetics flowed happily or unhappily between the subjective and the objective. There are no proofs in the matter of taste, but it's also not the case that there are no standards. I taught English, high school English and philosophy for 30 years. And invariably at the beginning of the course, a student would raise his hand and say, "Sir, how can you mark us in English? It's all subjective." And I had a number of responses to that, but the main one was, yeah, there might be an element of subjectivity, but what we're going to be looking at is a series of principles. And so throughout the course, I want to see how well you understand and how well you can apply these principles. And I'll have to evaluate them and put a grade on them. But I'm definitely inviting you to have a conversation about your work and the extent to which you think you've presented an understanding and an application of those principles. So what Kant presents here is very familiar to me in terms of my experience of trying to justify or rationalize an aesthetic, what might be an aesthetic judgment in terms of the subjectivity of English as opposed to math. And again, a lot of that ultimately happens through dialogue with the students and looking at the specifics and applying principles. So that's it for my part. I look forward to the discussion, and thanks. That's it. Thank you. I'll stop sharing the screen now, and we'll move to discussion. John, would you put us back to gallery view after I take care of this? There we go.
Thanks, Howard. Now we will start the discussion. Are you going to be to moderate by yourself?
Yeah, I will be the moderator. Thanks very much. I'll give a shot at moderating. Just a reminder to use the yellow hands, and I'll try and address them in sequence. Yep. Rick?
Yeah, hi, Howard. That was a great presentation, and had a lot of, there was a lot to it, right? I mean, you covered a great breadth of that subject. Something I'm interested in, though, is mimesis, and I'm reading a book right now, an audiobook. Actually, I'm listening to it on how we follow along. You know what I mean? It's that crowd mentality, the herd mentality, to a degree. And I found when you were showing the pictures of the peach, and in succession, it just looked like we were getting more abstract as we went to the right. And my thoughts were, that the first painting, in its realism was so real that, who would want that on their wall, right? That's my sensibility. Some people would, and I think that connotates order, and if you ask the question of the crowd, what is that? You would nary in 1,000 votes get anyone to say that, it wasn't a peach. Everyone would say it's a peach. So there's some order to that. Whereas in the one to the far right, you would say to people, what is that? What do you see? And, you could get a lot of blank stares at that. But what I saw in part of that was a figure coming out of a building, projected. And if I pointed that out to the crowd, I would think a lot of people would say, hey, yeah, I see that. I see that. And that's what Mimeticism is, right? So in art, I think you could show a piece of art. I was at a book signing last night as well with Terry Fallis, who's he's got nine novels out, a pretty famous Canadian author. And, I haven't read any of his books, but, after an hour and a half with them, I bought a book, right? And so, around the discussion of what he was doing, it was interesting to me in a mimetic point of view. He made his presentation. It was an hour. And then he said, any questions? and the crowd was sort of looking at each other. And he said, well, don't everybody put up their hands at once. But as soon as the first person put up their hand and he answered the question, the second followed, the third, the fourth, the fifth. One guy was having his own personal discussion amongst 100 people with him. You know what I mean? It got to that point. And really, he had to cut it off after a half an hour because it would have just went on. And that's mimetic. You know what I mean? So I really like that example of mimeticism, and I'm beginning to understand what it is. So that's my comment anyway on part of your presentation. Thank you.
That's great. And I think you make great points about sort of rational order and imagination, or what's posited as real, and a sort of openness, a different openness to experience. And of course, I like your point too about we can congeal around conformity of meanings as opposed to stuff that might be more open-ended and might require a conversation for us to tease out what's at the center of it, or how it makes us feel and why. Thanks very much, Rick.
Thank you.
I'm not seeing any yellow hands.
I'm not quite sure how to get the hand to go up.
Oh, okay.
Go to reaction.
Anyway, my hand is up.
I see. Yeah, very good. Thanks, Edward.
I was, as you were talking, and the collapse of the salons, and as we move through modern art, and I'm reminded of how it seemed to shift over the last 50 or 60 years into a lot of art simply reflecting the thoughts and ideas of the artist itself, rather than being driven by the people that wanted to buy the art, or at least that's kind of the way I've been thinking about it. But it drew me back to, and I'm still amused by the idea of actual muses and our art museums, and where we gather these pieces of art for seeking inspiration, trying to attract inspiration, and find homes for this Greek idea that I don't think actually ever went away, even if people don't realize it in their homes, that they're putting things on their walls. I don't know whether they're consciously trying to attract a muse to their residence, but I still have a feeling that idea of assembling what you might find aesthetic around you is an attempt to attract more of it.
And do you mean sort of by the muse, do you mean some sort of like transcendental agency, or do you mean sort of psychology? That
idea of inspiration, because it's where, and I think that's what the Greeks came back to on it, is where does that idea come from? Like you had Munch's Scream on there. Yeah. And it's like, I think that came, I always felt like that came out of nowhere for him. It always felt to me like he just stopped what he was doing when you underline that painting and see all the other work that he'd done beneath it. And that I think that just kind of fell out of him. At least that's the way it felt to me. And I had to wonder where that crossover comes from. Where did that element of just suddenly pouring out of a brush come from? And that's, I guess, the idea of museums. And I know collectively as a society, like we build museums for a purpose, obviously, to store expensive things. But that idea, and I think most cities' founding fathers would have said they didn't build the museums for that purpose. They built it to attract inspiration and education and knowledge to their communities, as if that idea of a muse is actually real, even though I think they would say it wasn't. I think that people like to believe it's real.
Right.
Anyway, I
think those institutions also confer aesthetic value in saying, this is, according to institutional understandings, and we're expert, or we have, background knowledge, this is worth calling your, attention to. I did, as I say at the end, I did run into this series of readings on aesthetics in everyday life and beauty in everyday life that really challenged the notion of gallery and institutional determinations of aesthetic value, and even art in itself. And that's just, part of that, and there's a huge range of opinion and philosophical positioning within those three pieces that I read on, aesthetics of everyday life. And some of it was as simple as, Zen stuff and smelling the coffee, or you're cutting your grass and there's an aesthetic pleasure in keeping the lines straight or curving, everything to building artistic communities locally, and so a huge range of stuff that detached beauty from art, but also especially from those institutions. I appreciate your comments lots. Thank you.
I've got two questions to ask you, Howard. By the way, I don't think the poets lie. I think the opposite is true.
Yeah. Okay.
But anyway, never mind. The first one that I want to ask, then I'll come back for another one later, is that you mentioned right at the beginning this distinction between Homo faber, that that man is some creature that makes something, and then Homo sapiens, right?
Right.
So knowing something.
Right.
But it's very interesting, isn't it? We don't actually call ourselves Homo faber, do we? Like the technical scientific name for the species
Right.
is Homo sapiens.
Right.
But it seems to prioritize that sort of knowledge or thinking, or that's the official name, as it were, for the species. I wonder why that is. Are we sort of downplaying, I don't know, art, or are we even downplaying engineering? That kind of thing. I just wondered what your thoughts were on that.
Well, sort of, it may be a rationalist bias, and maybe the nomenclature is more interested in the endpoint than how we got there. And I think those two sort of are inextricably connected. But I mean, there's a conception in a sort of rationalist society that art is, it's a luxury, it's a fringe activity, it's not really essential, it's decorative, it's ornamental, and, we can do without it. John Ralston Saul, ethicist, calls that the romantic slur. He says, if we specialize creativity and remove it from everyday life, then he says it's really damaging ethically and politically. So if we have this idea of the artistic creator as someone who's half mad and genius, but really marginal to everyday experience, that makes that compartmentalizes all aesthetics and makes leaves the world more at the mercy of sort of instrumentalists or technicians or technocrats or whatever that is. So it may be a question of political power too, but or maybe it's ultimately a values question.
Yeah. No, I mean, it just struck me. It was interesting. Before just go on to say, I just want to say, I was interested in that can opener that you were showing.
Yes, beautiful.
Because but I have one of those, and I think it's beautiful, but I have not the slightest idea how to use it.
Well, next time we get together, you'll bring it.
Yeah.
And you'll try it, and you'll just say, "This is a beautiful, wonderful."
Exactly. I need the advice of Homo faber. Right.
That's right.
Thanks.
Howard, does it open beer?
No, it doesn't have a can. It doesn't have a bottle opener on the other side. Good one.
Well, John,
I know which one it is, Howard.
What's that?
I have to know which one it is now.
Starfrit.
Okay, I do have that one too.
Do you like it, or do I have to convince you that it's a beautiful thing?
Oh, I do like it.
Yeah, it's nice. It's just so smooth compared to the old key ones that I had. This is just pleasure. Shasir?
Well, thank you so much. I'm going to have to look into this can opener now. It's got me going in a new direction.
The big takeaway from the presentation is
it's $15 on eBay or Amazon. $15 on Amazon.
Well, $10.99 a Canadian Tire. That's
you got me beat. It's the delivery of
it.
The laziness.
Well, I just really wanted to say first and foremost, Howard, that was a tremendous presentation, and I really appreciate it. There was so much I still needed to learn. Having said that, I think it was said that art can move your soul and thrum your heart. And that's the subjective part about the feelings that it can arouse, reaching you at the heart level as opposed to your conscious mind level. And the other statement I've come across is by Ursula Le Guin, who says science describes the world from the outside. Poetry, on the other hand, describes it from the inside. And these are really the type of subjective things art can do to us and certainly ignite so many different imageries in our own minds. One thing that you did say about Kant was the fact that art is really disinterested in people. And I was surprised that you didn't mention the elitist part of art, where it becomes a possession of treasure as opposed to an art, really. And where does that boundary lie?
Yes.
I'll stop.
I like all those points. I think when it's bizarre, like when Kant talks about disinterest, he says it's severed from desire. And this is what I found really bizarre about Kant. And then I did a little dug a little deeper, and it made sense. I mean, how can one really talk about beauty and pleasure without talking about sexual attraction, really, as part of that, or at least as a, you know, as a natural component of that? And then apparently I read for Kant, sexuality outside of marriage and for any purpose other than procreation was degrading. So he wants to decouple, I think he wants to decouple aesthetic experience from desire generally. And I think also a lot of critics have talked about how his third critique of pure judgment, kind of attempted to fill a gap that the other two critiques didn't somehow address. And he was looking for something that maybe in a way sort of ineffable, where the other two sort of had arrived at concrete absolute truths. He recognized that there was something missing, and he still, I think, deals with it in mostly cognitive terms. But yeah.
However, does the valuations on art deplete its ability to be reached by the masses?
Sorry, would you repeat that?
Does the valuation in dollar terms
Yes.
take away from the masses to be able to access that art?
Yes. I mean, now it's we don't have to have an original, we can have a print, right? Which is accessible. I mean, do you remember in that first set of slides, I included the dogs playing poker as a sort of example of popular art. So aesthetic appreciation covers a range of experiences, and I guess one of the joys is people having discussions about a beauty and whether something has aesthetic value for them or not, or why or why not. I was talking with John earlier about the Barbie movie and how controversial was that was, and some people absolutely loved it, and some people said, no, this isn't, you know, this is sort of just popular entertainment, it's candy. And someone said, well, no, I think there's more to it than that. And someone said, well, I really like the aesthetics, the colors were great, I wasn't so crazy about the theme. So I think where I do land with Kant is that, as with philosophy itself, there might not be determinate answers about aesthetic judgment, and there might not be determinate answers in other philosophical questions, but the pleasure we get somewhere from having those discussions, even if we clarify the stuff to ourselves. And there's a pleasure in having those discussions and sharing those ideas. So, you know, that comes back to Plato and Socrates and the value of dialogue as well, right? Good points. I liked your points about the kind of the heart and the soul, and maybe that gets at the idea that beauty is ineffable, right? And maybe beyond understanding, or parts of it are beyond understanding. And I mentioned neuroscience a fair bit, and I don't want to reduce, you know, joy or beauty to neurons firing in specific patterns. I mean, ultimately, you may come down to that, but I think there is there's so much complexity in terms of consciousness that, you know, I don't want to reduce it to that, and you know, recognize that there's fundamental human stuff going on. And that's why I included that picture of that couple dancing in the that older couple dancing in the forest. It's just the human relational stuff is just, you know, there's so much going on that moves us, right? Moves us emotionally. And some people have said you can't really be moved intellectually until you're moved emotionally. The stuff happens here. The changes of philosophy begin here and only, you know, subsequently move to the head.
This is why the politicians want to win your hearts before they win your minds.
Yes. Talk about the Plato's critique of rhetoric, right? Oh, Ray, you have your hand up. I see a white hand up with Ray Hardy, but I don't know whether that's the same as the yellow hand, just with a different screen. Oh, there we go. Hey, Tori, how are you? Oh, you're muted still.
There we go. Thanks, Howard, and thanks for the presentation. Like was said before, you covered lots of ground, and that was great. I'm just going to focus on one point or a couple, and in sort of following on what John mentioned about your distinction between Homo faber and Homo sapien, and also Kant's critique of judgment. These are what I want to focus on. There was a Italian philosopher in the 1700s, Giambattista Vico, who was very repulsed by the whole Cartesian and scientific revolution, which was very empirical. Let's just look at the real world and try to derive, scientific truth from empirical science. But Vico's point was that, and he said it in Latin, the truth. He basically said, only what humans make is true. You can only know truth by truth is something that's made, and it portends to art. We make art, but we also make scientific theories about the world. These are sort of constructed representations, mimetic, and we think of them as mimetic constructions of what the real world is. So Jean-Baptiste Vico's idea was the made and the truth are interchangeable, and from that he kind of derives this somewhat anti-Cartesian philosophy that's also anti-dualistic. You mentioned subject and object, and sort of beauty and aesthetics are somewhere in between subject and object. But I think there's a point there that whether you're an artist or a poet or an actor on the stage who's trying to present, the truth of some character or some narratives, tragedy or comedy. It's a production. It's a made. The truth that you're trying to convey is manufactured. And that's how the truth is understood. So you can say from the made, and the made is equivalent to the true, like Jean-Baptiste Vico said. It's also the same thing as saying, beauty is truth. Truth is beauty. So the aesthetic is sort of almost like an epistemological issue. It's a metaphysical issue, not just kind of aesthetics as being one subcategory of philosophy. It's almost like the philosophy. It is the metaphysical point. And Kant, according to this more contemporary philosopher Gadamer, Hans-Georg Gadamer, who's German, considered Kant to downplay, in his critique of judgment, he downplayed the notion of good taste in art as being it's really kind of conventional. Whatever people think is nice to look at is just kind of that's what art is. And actually the Scottish school of philosophy at the time, which included Adam Smith, was talking much more about common sense in a very different way than the way Kant finally sort of cast his judgment of what the conventional assessments of beauty and ugliness is. And so Kant really missed the boat, according to this philosopher Gadamer, and that actually it's this aesthetic sensibility of judgment in a more full sense that lies in between subject and object. That's where truth really comes out in its fullest, but it sort of makes truth a function of representation by the artist, whether that artist is an actor or a painter or even a scientist who's coming up with a beautiful theory of something that explains reality. So just a sort of another connection between Homo faber and Homo sapien.
I'm trying to think, and you've offered so much there, and my mind's kind of working to make some connections. So I have some responses, but I can go to other heads. I mean, I was thinking about the difference, even a distinction between aesthetic experience and aesthetic judgment. By the time we move to aesthetic judgment, we're placing a value on something, whereas aesthetic experience doesn't require a judgment. It just requires, you know, being in that mode, or being with that, in that experience.
Yeah, you can kind of over intellectualize it.
Yeah.
But you also sort of will resonate with some art or performance more than another one. So you could say that when that resonance happens, internally to the individual, there's a truth being conveyed there. Yeah.
Yeah, it might be. I don't know whether it's I don't want to reduce it to psychological symmetry, but when he talks about truth being made, it's a social constructivist argument, isn't it? Just to try and clarify for me, or cultural constructionist argument. And whichever narrative tends to maybe have more political, economic clout behind it is the one that might become part of the dominant culture. Am I reading what you said accurately?
Well, the making part is more, not so much socially constructive, but just expressive of the person, but expressive, obviously, in the medium, whether it's language or, you know, like poetry or fiction, or the medium is performance art, or the medium is, you know, painting and sculpture, whatever the medium is, it's being conveyed. So it, in a sense, it's kind of social, because everybody, you're not going to understand what the individual who's expressing the art, you know, is trying to say. So in that sense, it sort of has a social constructive element, but it's really about the expression of the artist. You know, he or she is making something, and that making is the only way that you can start evaluating whether something's true or not. You know, the truth is not just an epistemological thing, it's an aesthetic thing. I don't know. That's sort of,
I mean, Robert Creeley says a poem is energy transferred. Sort of what you mean?
Energy, yeah. To think about that, but yeah.
Thanks. That was great. Someone else? I'm looking for another hand. I'm looking for a hand.
You always miss
John.
my hand. You always miss my hand.
You know, because you have a yellow background. Your ceiling's a yellow background, so the hand gets lost.
It doesn't stand out.
Yeah, well, you'll be pleased to learn that's going to be off-white fairly soon.
Just a tip for you, Howard. It's usually in the left top corner, the one who is hands. So maybe keep an eye on it.
Yeah. So this is kind of my second question I wanted to ask Howard, which is this. When you talked about the possibility of an objective set of principles for aesthetics, you focus mainly on formalism. And you focus mainly on formalism.
Yes.
Yeah. It was sort of almost the impression was left that only formalism, as it were, could give an objective set of ethics. But I agree with you and Torrey and most others that I don't think that's a very attractive principle. You know, the formalism is not a very attractive principle. But I would like to ask you this question. Would you rule out the possibility of an objective set of principles for aesthetics based on values? And I'll give you an example of what I mean. I think in one of the PPS things that Ronan and I are doing, we're going to start to talk about human flourishing. And actually, Alla, again, in the other series, Alla, you asserted that human flourishing is the ultimate objective of philosophy. Well, could you not make the idea then that, you know, good art is that which contributes to human flourishing? It obviously is going to be different for different people, because the essence of different people is there are goods, there are human goods, but each individual puts a different weight. You know, courage might be a good, or, you know, whatever, beauty might be a good, but each individual puts a different weight on each of these human goods. But I think, how can I put it? I think you can definitely rule out human bads. So, for example, just to take two of your examples, it's hard for me to argue that Austin Powers, for example, would contribute to human flourishing. Right. Or it's very hard for me to think that, you know, dogs playing poker, you know, contributes to human flourishing.
Well, there's a strong ethical message in there. You know what the title of that piece is?
No, I don't.
a friend in need, and one of the dogs is passing a card under the table to the other dog.
It doesn't seem quite ethical to me, if I'm honest.
No. Well,
But-
it's the
but-
tension between friendship and conventional ethics. I'm just messing with
Okay,
you.
but would you allow for, or would you be prepared to canvass, you know, an objective set of aesthetics based on values? I mean, the communists, for example, thought that socialist realism should be the only art. So I just wondered what your thought was on that general idea.
Sure. I mean, I'm happy to offer that. I was wondering if someone else would want to jump into that just to spread it around a bit, and then we can circle back to my own two-bit opinion later. Okay. I mean, your point about socialist realism points to the potential dangers of that. And again, it makes aesthetics subservient to a utilitarian value. I mean, I look for, and maybe it's personal, so it's not objective. I look for a fundamental humanism in art, and if stuff seems, if the characters are too self-interested, or if it celebrates treachery, I guess it's a fairly Platonic view. But I guess making aesthetics subservient to either ethics or social political theory seems in some ways to narrow it. And I think, I mean, there's fascist architecture and Nazi art as well. So there's art that celebrates, kind of, brute power and mythologizing history and all this stuff. So, we'd have to first, I guess, define, what the world needs now in terms of human flourishing, not to butcher Burt Bacharach, and then, devise our aesthetic around that in a way that authentically involves people. And if we approach it rhetorically, then we're probably degrading one of the principles of aesthetics anyways. I want to get this person to act this way, or vote for this X, or take this action, so I'm going to use the principles of art or aesthetic or psychology to create an appeal. I mean, I think aesthetics feels broader than either ethics or social political theory. I haven't worked out the dynamics between those.
Well, I think I'm going to agree with you on political ideology. I mean, I think we can agree that socialism isn't socialist realism is not art, because its ultimate objective is to impose a point of view on people, right?
I'm not sure I completely agree with that, but anyways, yeah.
Well, yeah, but you see, I would argue that the human flourishing approach. So let's sort of, for the purpose of the argument, let's say that we agree that it shouldn't be used to push political ideology,
propaganda, right?
Yeah, propaganda of either side. So we've ruled out formalism. We've ruled out, propaganda, if you want to put it that way, right? Okay. But the point about the human flourishing is the way that people usually set up human flourishing. They set it up as a series of human goods. And typically, when you talk about human flourishing, maybe Ella would comment on that, because she's canvassed human flourishing in a moment as the ultimate objective. Typically, people agree on what those 8 or 9 human goods are. You mentioned some of them, like courage, or truthfulness, or whatever. And there's surprising agreement on the basket of goods. So the ace in the hole is that you allow for subjectiveness in a certain sense, because each individual can put, I might value, so courage, shall we say, more than somebody else, or I might vary courage or bravery less than somebody else. But I have to have some of it, if you see what I'm getting at. And so the secret then is that it would rule out human bads.
Humans?
So it would rule out human bads. You wouldn't be allowed to include bads in your weighting.
Okay.
You sort of mean, lying, for example. So if your art encouraged lying or whatever, right? If your art encouraged murder or whatever it happens to be, then you automatically rule that out. But then there would still be a wide range of quote subjective judgments, but The point is you have an objective set of principles on which to make these decisions. And I think you would rule out Austin Powers. I'm not being fair. I maybe.
Well, I would rule it out too as great art, but it's
yeah,
important to laugh. But
yes, but aren't we doing that? Aren't we then in agreement? So I see others that want to come in, but I just want to draw you out on that.
Sure. I mean, I have some thoughts about that, but Ronan, are you responding to John?
Yes, I am responding to John specifically.
Great. And other points too, and I can circle back to John's point. Yeah.
I was just going to say,
and Sherman is asked a question as well.
Yeah, I think Sherman was first, but I'm going to respond directly to John just for a second. I think it might be a bit dangerous to associate human flourishing with aesthetics and art, only because, you know, if you're arguing, John, that in order for art to be acceptable, it has to be sort of in agreement with human flourishing, then it raises the question of who decides which art is in agreement with human flourishing. Somebody has to make that judgment. So I think potentially there can be an ethical issue that arises here, because you know, some would argue that X art is good for human flourishing, and others would argue that it's, you know, not good for human flourishing. And this, you know, happens all the time. So, you know, one of the things that Kant argues is that that art or that aesthetic judgment has to be disinterested. And what I think he meant by that is that it really has to be removed from practical or personal interests. So it doesn't really matter what your personal interests are or what your personal values are. Art transcends that. And, you know, so it has to also transcend, in my opinion, human flourishing. It's just a thing that you can appreciate for itself, even if you don't agree with it, even if it goes contrary to your own personal, emotional, even if it repulses you, you know, you can still perceive it as art and say, yes, I appreciate its form, I appreciate, you know, how it was made, even though it repulses me. And in my opinion, I think it actually detracts from human flourishing.
Yeah, thanks, Ronan. I was going to make a similar point. Sherman?
So I just want to add one other matter to this complex topic. Why is it that religious art continues to be very popular, admired? So just to carry on Ronan's point, a person could be non-religious, a person may not be Catholic, but that person is just in awe when he's in St. Peter's Cathedral and he's looking at the ceiling painting by Michelangelo. But what makes that great art? So I'm not Catholic, let's say, I don't believe in God, but I'm spellbound by this building and the painting inside of it. So why does that become so why does that art become so powerful? That's a question I'd like to ask.
Well,
what makes religious art so attractive to so many people, even if they are not religious?
And how do you answer that? What do you make of that?
Well, maybe it has something to do with John's point that it relates to human flourishing. And I think it has something to do with Ronan's point too, where it's the act of creative power. And it's, could it be non-judgmental? I'm not sure. But it does seem to slip into a Kantian quality too. Again, we just look at Michelangelo. What makes his painting so powerful, or his statue of David or David? What makes those things just so powerful? I'm not quite sure the answer myself. They just seem to bring universal admiration despite of one's cultural religious background? That's just an open question. I don't know if that can be answered.
Yeah.
But
I mean, I understand the cathedral more than David, just in terms of the grandeur of it. John? John? You're muted. Sorry, you're muted, John.
Yeah, I knew, so I wasn't actually intending to say anything. You wanted me to respond to something?
You're muted now, Howard.
You're muted, Howard.
John Monis, did you have your hand up? And it looks
Oh,
like
John, I thought you were talking to me. I do apologize.
No.
Yeah.
John, are you going to unmute yourself?
I think
maybe,
he just
yes.
clipping you.
I was just going to respond to Sherman there, and just a very, very quick point. You know, a big part of your presentation had to do with art and beauty. And I think it all boils down to beauty when you're talking about St. Peter's Cathedral. You know, just the size of it and the sheer beauty of it all, you know, it's awe-inspiring. It might mean more to some people, it might mean less to others, but I think to everyone it's going to mean at least beauty, religious or not.
I think there are formalist principles at work there, and realist representational principles as well, and also, you know, principles of scale and proportion and grandeur and size. I mean, just remember, maybe it was 20 years ago, National Gallery had purchased this picture called Voice of Fire, and it cost however many millions of dollars, and there was a huge uproar because it was, I don't know, 3 lines or something. And then so I went to the National Gallery, and I walked in and I saw it, and I was awestruck. And part of it was just the sheer magnitude. It was a play between sort of immensity, magnitude, and simplicity. And I walked in, and you know, I was literally taking aback. So there's something about proportionality that might explain St. Peter's Cathedral. And there's, you know, representational elements. There's balance, proportion, symmetry. I haven't broken that down sort of aesthetically, but one could probably do to that piece what, you know, we did with lion attacking a horse, in terms of looking at the sort of formalist principles at work there, and then shoot that through just the grandeur of it. So that would be my explanation off the top of my head.
And the sheer difficulty of the endeavor also.
It also reminds me of what Vonnegut, I think, in Bluebird, when somebody critiqued that type of art that you're describing, and said along the lines of, my child could have painted that, that common criticism for that. And the artist's response is, but they didn't. I did. So being the first to do something is often an element in this, right? That they were the first ones to think of doing that. And there's also, John, I think you were talking about images shouldn't lie, but like think about René Magritte, and a lot of his images, he was painting lies. Deliberately. And I think art is often reactionary to the pressures that are being put upon it. And when politics pushes it one way, the art will often go the other way. And when art loses, I think, track of itself, its own sense of humor comes back, and you end up with pieces like Comedian, which was that banana taped to the wall. You know, that's just art just pushes itself all the way back over and says, look how silly I am. And it goes back in another direction. I think it's just a constant response back and forth to the way people think and are believing today. And it's always, I almost feel like it's always a reaction more than it is anything else.
Yeah,
Just
I mean, it's a dynamic of culture and the art that came before this thing. I had that picture of Duchamp's urinal.
Fountain, yeah.
He calls it fountain, right?
Fountain, yeah.
And I was thinking about all that Renaissance and classical art that had cherubs peeing in the fountain, and how did that emerge as a sort of aesthetic trope of, you know, young boys peeing in the water. So I wondered whether he partially selected that title to forge the connection between kind of urinating in a urinal and urinating in a fountain or whatever. But so yeah, there's a number of dynamics. And I had a slide about Andy Warhol being the antithesis of Jackson Pollock, in terms of the sort of the primalness of Jackson Pollock and the pure emotion, and then Andy Warhol's Marilyn's or Soup. They're very industrial, they're very, you know, mechanical, and they're very sort of synthetic. So stuff works in reaction. The other thing I found about the expressionists, I read somewhere that later sort of abstract expressionists were reacting against McCarthyism. And so it was a gesture of freedom. And I just want to, put stuff out there and paint from within. And I don't want to have a center of focus, and I want to leave it open. So the freedom was a reaction to a sense of, political repression. But then the abstract Pollock and Mark Rothko and those other guys, they got co-opted by the US government during the Cold War. And they did all sorts of tours in Europe, and they were touted as, a quintessentially American expressionist, because it didn't have boundaries, they weren't held by rules, they were pro freedom, and this is the American aesthetic. And then they got sort of slammed for that. And then I wonder whether Warhol was in some ways commenting on the commercialization of art and mass production of art. There's an entire dynamic in terms of politics, intellectual history, and the aesthetics that came before it, right?
Okay, I think Sherman had a last question, as
sorry,
we are running
Sorry, Sherman.
out of time. Thanks
Sorry,
a lot, Sherman, for participation, and thank to Howard, and thanks to everyone. It really was insightful presentation and discussion. I enjoyed very, very much, and it was really deep, and Henry commented it's rich presentation, which I totally agree, and maybe everyone as well. So thanks for your good work, Howard. And on Thursday, December the 7th, we will meet for the first episode of the philosophy discussion program. That will be part 2 of the conversation between Ronen Grunberg and John Smithen on critical realism. Thank you very much all for coming, and looking forward to see you all next time.